You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Today, we're looking at burnout, stress, and coping in the ambulance service with Jo Mildenhall. So, Jo Mildenhall joins us back on the podcast to explore this critical and indeed under-discussed issue in pre-hospital care, that of burnout. So, frontline ambulance staff experience some of the highest rates of sickness absence in the NHS, with stress, anxiety, and depression frequently cited as the cause. So, while much attention has been given to the impact of traumatic events, emerging research suggests that the cumulative effect of daily stress, that of routine operational pressures, organisational friction, and relentless demands may be just as damaging, if not more so. So in the conversation, we're going to unpack some of the informal coping mechanisms that paramedics often turn to, such as cognitive strategies, gallows humour, and peer support, and why these are often preferred over formal interventions like debriefs or structured risk management programs. So Jo is really going to reflect on her own experience, but also the empirical literature to bring in how workplace culture, leadership, and peer relationships shape how paramedics manage stress, and what we can do to protect psychological well-being on the front line. Welcome back to the podcast, Jo.
Oh, thank you very much for having me back.
It's great to have you with us, actually. Just as a framer, Jo, I wondered if you could just start maybe by, we know sickness and absence through burnout in the ambulance service is significantly higher than elsewhere in the NHS. Quoted figures from 53.9% of staff relate to burnout. But could I get you, from your experience? We'll look at the literature shortly, but really from your experience, what are some of the key contributors to this trend?
Well, that's a really good opener. And first of all, just put it into context. So it's a real problem for the NHS ambulance services, but it's one that's really not new, as you've said there. And in fact, if you look across the world, ambulance services, they've all face the same challenges with regard to sickness absence, particularly around stress and mental health. So I just had a quick peek at the percentages this morning, actually, just to see where we're at. And NHS ambulance services are consistently reporting higher sickness absence rates, as you said, particularly when you compare that against all the NHS professions and areas. And we're typically looking around 7 to 9.7%, whereas the NHS national average is 5.3 to 5.7%. And when you consider that each of those percentage points represents, humans, actual people, we're looking at a huge amount of people experiencing poor mental health there when you think about the numbers of people in the ambulance sector. So that's just to put it in context. And then when you look into the data, it shows that the leading cause of sickness is categorized as anxiety, stress, and depression. And that really accounts for more than a quarter of the reasons for absence. So you're asking about key contributors to this trend, and some of the things we're actually going to, I hope, talk about in a bit more depth. So what I will say is that I think from personal experience and from being a researcher in this area, that the psychological and the emotional elements of our work are actually key factors in this, as well as important cultural and relational factors that perhaps we don't normally think about. So I'll leave it at that, because I hope that we're going to unpack that a little bit further.
Yeah, indeed we will. But look, much of the data really links to occupational stress in paramedicine due to traumatic incident exposure. But as you were saying, there's really a growing recognition that there's more at play than just exposure to different incidents at work that have kind of daily stress and or daily hassles. Could I get you to maybe unpack for us what you think and why they might be overlooked?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. And we know, as you said, we do know that exposure to and the impact of exposure to trauma and distressing situations, sort of that acute impact and cumulative exposures can occur and impact us as individuals, but also as teams. And that's something that we talked about in our last webinar. However, like you say, there's this whole host of organisational and systemic factors that equally have similar impacts, both contributing to acute and chronic poor psychological health in paramedics and ambulance personnel. So, for example, on the one hand, you've got workplace issues such as bullying, encountering violence incidents, those sorts of things, worsening operational pressures from handover delays, which I'm sure many of your listeners will, empathise with, increased call numbers, incidents actually taking longer due to patients having more complex comorbidities, etc. Those things are all contribute, even if they're sort of small and add up. But also it's those other things like not getting breaks regularly, frequent shift overruns. So you've kind of got that side of things. Whereas you also mentioned daily hassles, of which there are some, but they are a huge contributor towards staff mental health. So just to unpack that a bit further, by daily hassles, we mean, there's everyday situations that happen in the workplace. And for me, an important aspect of this is really around organisational culture. And that's a term that I think is used a lot. But essentially, if you look at it, at its basic level, it's really looking at the way we do things around here, and it's well documented in the research that ambulance services face huge challenges in terms of their internal culture. You only have to look at the cultural reviews that have been done in different services over the last few years. And the findings from those reviews, as well as other literature, is like it can be from how people are spoken to, how issues are acknowledged, if they are at all, how those issues are managed, the way leadership is practiced. One of the key factors in the development of stress and poor mental health is, in my opinion, the relationship between leaders and their team members and vice versa. And I'm sure you've had other speakers on your podcast who will have talked about that sort of critical relationship between the two. But I'd really like to emphasize, the sheer influence that relationship can have, particularly in terms of influencing mental health outcomes. And when you look at the literature, I think some of the most important research, in my opinion, is really studied that organisational culture within ambulance organisations, as well as other uniforms professions. There's quite a lot of research in the policing sphere. It's not only how street level bureaucracy, but also organisational bureaucracy has contributed to poor mental health of employees, and in some cases actually led to psychological harm. And I think that's something that really needs to be explored further.
So just looking at the formal coping strategies, Joe, like debriefs or indeed trim. But the research suggests many paramedics and hospital staff prefer informal approaches rather than the formal ones. But why could I get you to speak to really why you think there is such a preference for these more informal strategies?
Yeah, again, that's a great question. And I think at a fundamental level, there's really something about talking to those who you've already built a relationship with, because perhaps, they're friends, colleagues, people you've worked with for a while, or perhaps those who you share commonalities with, like you share the same station, the same manager, you're a similar age, character, etc. And we know from research that peer support, when it's experienced positively, because that's an important bit, can have a huge positive impact on people's mental health. And we know that it can, in the early stages, mediate against the development of post-traumatic stress reactions sometimes. And it was a while back now, but I actually wrote and had an article published about this. And I talked about how the culture was changing within the sector and how we'd started to move away from being able to sort of converge with our colleagues in the crew room after a difficult job, whereas we kind of lost that from our culture now because it's so busy. But yeah, I don't think you can underestimate the power of peer support and the value that's in it for everyone when they're sort of participating in it. You mentioned trim, and I just wanted to pick up on that because I suppose one of the limitations of peer support is that the person who's doing the supporting might not be aware of changes to look out for people when they're experiencing traumatic distress. Whereas trim offers the chance to talk to somebody who is trained in spotting those things and then signposting them on to relevant help. But I guess, with all interventions, there are positives and limitations to trim as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And to your point, the rapport for peer support is already there, but also because that's the case, the warning signs may go unnoticed, because they aren't either picked up on, or there's no formalized training in the peer. Could I get you to maybe unpack for us just why and how important occupational culture is in shaping really the way that stress is dealt with? And also, I guess in a way, another question would be, is there any stigma really around acknowledging burnout or psychological distress within teams?
Best way to answer this is by bringing in some of my own research findings. Um, so we've already started talking about culture and particular aspects of culture that are known to contribute to poor mental health. But the question you've asked is a really great one, because you're saying, okay, we know that culture shapes mental health of employees, but how does it shape the way people deal with stress and psychological distress? And this is a question that's not always asked. So I did my research study literally after the COVID pandemic was declared in the UK. So it was April 2020, and it was a 1 year longitudinal study, following 30 ambulance personnel over that time. And it included people who were on the front line as ECAs, emergency care assistants, paramedics, all, to middle managers. So senior managers were also invited to take part, but none did. And it covered 7 of the English ambulance services. And as I followed them for a year, doing interviews, periodically throughout that time, one of the things that really came across was how the relationships, the behaviours, the attitudes of people that these participants were interacting with at work shaped how they managed their emotions, both inwardly and outwardly. And here's, a really good point to refer to the work of Arlie Hochschild, who coined the theory of emotional labour. So essentially, that means to how we manage our emotions at work. And if we add in a good dollop of social psychology as well around groups, then what I began to see from my participants was that there was unspoken, often unrecognised rules operating in the real bowels of organisational culture that determined how they would show their emotional responses, if at all, and then how that impacted on how they dealt with the stress or distress that they were feeling. So just to give an example, one of the most ingrained emotion rules that some talked of was around not showing emotions in response to events that they'd experienced at work during the pandemic. And again, these were rules that were operating at such a depth in the culture that they weren't always explicitly recognised by their participants as they talked through the scenarios. And there was a real sense that came across of this man up and get on with it that we know is historically associated with ambulance culture. But it was really, really stopped me in my tracks to how prevalent this still was. And what it meant for those participants, as they talked about their experiences, what they would, the way that they tried to deal with that stress and distress was modified by these sort of emotional behavioral feeling rules. So they started denying their emotions, hiding their emotional responses, or even avoiding them completely. One thing that was maybe a bit different about my study when you compare it to other studies is that it looked at these cultural rules and how it impacted people's emotional regulation and their coping behaviours from a collective view. So there was a lot here around how people are influenced in groups, for example, to display certain emotions or hide them, or because they wanted to maintain their identity and cohesion to other members of the group. There's loads more to my findings, although I think we can't cover them all because we'll be here all day, and I know your listeners will have busy lives and things to get on with. But just to say, I'm hoping to have a paper published on this shortly, which will go into this in more detail and also look at organisational harm. So that's one to look out for if anyone's particularly interested in this area.
Yeah, indeed. And we'll put links to some of your fantastic research in the show notes, Joe, because I think it is prudent to do a deep dive on this subject, and people can go away and just really get into the details in the background. Something else which is, the literature highlights is these cognitive mechanisms commonly used, is informal strategies of coping. Could I get you to maybe unpack for us, Joe, what this means in practice? What do these mechanisms look like on a day to day?
Yeah, so cognitive mechanisms, just to break that down, refers to the way that we perceive things, we think about them and process them. So there's some situations that we can't change, like we still want to we still want to be employed within this field by our employer. Still got to do our work. And of course, we know that due to the nature of our work, we will encounter things that at times will be upsetting and distressing. That's the nature of our job. So there are some ways that we can manage these situations through our perceptions of them and by re-evaluating stresses. So some strategies that people find helpful are what we call cognitive reframing. So that's where you notice thoughts that you're having about whatever's going on, the situation, and you then actively change how you think about them. So like you shift the focus away from feeling overwhelmed towards a more problem or solution focused approach. And then we've got cognitive restructuring. And that essentially draws on cognitive behavioral therapy techniques to identify negative thoughts and to evaluate them for their validity and replacing them with balanced, realistic perspectives. So this is really helpful when, like we can go to incidents and they perhaps haven't gone as well as we'd hoped or not gone well at all. And you sort of get into that rumination cycle and self-criticism, of replaying that job and you could have done this, or I could have done that better. And this cognitive restructuring is a really helpful technique when you're in that space because it can stop you having those negative thoughts. So it's about noticing the thoughts, challenging yourself on them as to their validity. Are they realistic? And if they're not, then you replace them with balanced and realistic perspectives. So it stops that rumination. And then the final one I'd suggest is around meaning making. And this is one we're perhaps most familiar with. So it's simply looking to make sense of what's happened. And we can do this instinctively. And we can look at a situation, say, what can this adversity teach us? What can we use from our experience of it to help us move forwards? So it's kind of a bit of a reflector, but it's more than that because you're looking at the meaning making.
Yeah, absolutely. And all those strategies have a certain amount of utility in reframing, as you were saying, and trying to contextualize the stressors. But could I get to, you speak to the mechanism of peer support. It also came out really as one of the most used coping mechanisms and methods. What makes peer support? So we've spoken to the rapport and being known by others, in a peer group. But are there risks to relying solely on peer-to-peer conversations, Joe?
Well, firstly, I feel that you can't underestimate the power of peer support. It's uh, I'll give you the positives first, and then I'll go on to the limitations of it. So it's really rooted in shared experience, and when we speak the same language to someone else who understands the reality of what you've been through or experienced, because they've been there as well. There's so much power in that. And it's also because they've got that connection with you, you don't have to explain everything about the job that other people who aren't in the sector might not understand. And that goes such a long way towards shared empathy, trust, and acceptance. There's not that need to translate your experiences, if you like, as you might to someone who's got no lived experience of being an ambulance practitioner. So that's a really valuable point to peer support. And also because you can do that and when peer support is really positive, it can allow people to speak really openly. And then that can challenge any stigmatizing attitudes and behaviours. And also, it creates trust. And that's also really important because it facilitates a safe, confidential space. And we talk about like psychological safety and feeling safe enough to talk, to get it off your chest. And that's absolutely vital. And obviously, with peer support, because it's informal, it can often be there right when you've just done the job. If the right people are around you, they're on other crews or, happen to be back at the station or whatever. But then they tend to be there when you need them later on as well, because they're there, they're your colleagues, your friends, family members even. So it's got some real benefits, but there's also some negatives or, limitations when we rely solely on peer support. So I mentioned trust, and you've really got to have trust, because without it won't happen. There'd be worries about confidentiality, gossiping, especially if you belong to a really tight-knit ambulance station. I know that I visited one ambulance service, and this was a real issue that they'd found as they'd implemented peer support programs. There was a real worry about essentially gossiping and not having that confidentiality. And then also because of that, having fears about the impact on your career. So that needs to be kept in check. And then there's also the impact on the listener. So if, they might have their own stuff going on and then they're listening, supporting someone else. And over, a period of time, that could lead to compassion fatigue. And one way around that is if it's actually a formal peer support program at work, then really they should have mechanisms in place for that, sort of around psychological supervision, just to reduce that impact of listening to others' trauma on a regular basis whilst trying to manage their own things as well. So it's about having that balance really and having the right support processes in place for not only the peer that needs to talk, but also the supporter.
So let's pivot slightly, Joe, and look at leadership and some of the systemic issues around leadership that impacts burnout. And maybe if I could get you to really, I guess in a way, to share your thoughts on, both operationally and clinically, the impacts of leadership on burnout and the culture around managing stress in frontline teams.
Oh gosh, I know there's so much I could talk about here, but I'll try and keep it fairly succinct. Essentially leadership has a huge impact on burnout and stress, but also on the organisational culture too, because they're very much interwoven. So one thing I think is really important here is role modelling, particularly from the leader's perspective in normalising vulnerability. Which can be really challenging, because leaders typically, typically find it difficult to be vulnerable, particularly around their own emotions, because I think they feel a lot of pressure. I was once an ambulance manager, and you do feel a lot of pressure to take care of your team, and in doing so, you kind of hold back your own emotions to look after your team. So there is that challenge around normalizing a vulnerability and about being open to how things impact you, and having those conversations around mental health. But it's particularly helpful because it can break down barriers about talking about mental health and the stigmas that come with that. And, almost gives your team members permission to speak about their own difficulties that they're having with their mental health if they see the leader doing that. So it's actually really powerful in itself. And then if we think about leaders and the impact that they have on employees' psychological health, we can look at the support that they give to staff and the way that's communicated and the values that are placed on staff wellbeing, and actually being genuine in asking how people are. That also can go such a long way. It's such a simple thing, but it can go such a long way. And staff know when leaders or others aren't being genuine. They can spot it a mile off. So it's about being genuine and having those conversations and having those critical emotional skills, which are sometimes referred to as soft skills. Although I personally don't like that term, so I'll call it critical emotional skills. And I mean things like listening, empathy, having emotional intelligence, recognizing what's being said as well as what's not being said, engaging with staff regularly so that they feel seen and heard. Again, simple things that can make a massive difference in validating how someone feels. And I've seen that through my research that I did during COVID. It was those participants whose managers behaved in these ways, engaged with them. You saw that relationship was much stronger, and they actually did seem to fare much better through that period.
So you've kind of answered the next question, which is really the gap between policy and lived experience on the road, and how we can close that gap. And we've kind of spoken to that, but could I get you to emphasize that? Because I think people can really feel like there is a disconnect between policy and real life lived experience on the road. And you've notioned towards, living the values, living the values of the ambulance service, and especially from a leadership perspective, embodying those. And making sure there's consistency at 3 a.m. or 3 p.m. that a duty manager is on station, and that there's good maybe emergency operation coordination to say, look, this is a very stressful situation for the crew. Can someone meet them? And there's those check-ins, having trim available 24/7, or indeed, having that service, access to the service. But could I get you to speak to sort of closing that policy gap?
When you look back over the last 20 years or so, because I'm a bit of a dinosaur, I've been around for a little while. There's definitely been positive moves in terms of the approach organisations are taking towards employee mental health. So there are still issues, as I've just said in my last answer, but it is better than it was. We have access to more services now. There's greater understanding and acceptance that the job we do can have psychological implications sometimes. And in parts of the country, there's definitely more happening. And there's some services that are being really innovative in what they're providing to staff. But I think where we really need to do more work is around that sort of policy side and giving focus to the organisational and systemic issues that are causing or perpetuating harm, and looking at that in a lot more detail, because a lot of this goes on under the surface, and it's about tapping into that, seeing what's actually going on, how behaviours influence other people, and ambulance services are trying to take approaches to try and mitigate against some of these issues, certainly at a wider level, particularly when you think about things like bullying and sexual safety and such like. And I know, more practically, like one service has now stopped 2-hour shifts, night shifts, sorry, and more than 2 in a row, because the research data shows how fatigued staff were becoming. But there's still this gap, as you speak about, and there's still this need to get more upstream, if you like, in preventing the issues before they occur. And if we utilise organisational psychology, I think we really need to look at real basic things like the language used within policies, such that they are trauma informed, and they recognise the value staff bring to the workplace rather than perhaps taking a very limited approach to whatever it is that the policy is requesting, and taking a sort of blaming discourse. So it's about really looking at the language that's used within policies, and wording them so that they are more people friendly.
Let's pivot and look at, as we're starting to come into land slightly on the conversation, there's a couple more questions. One would be around just looking out for signs of burnout, and what should people be mindful of, both in themselves and other people?
Burnout is really prevalent in the sector, as it is across all the emergency services. And the thing with burnout is it can creep up on people before it taps you on the shoulder. And this is something that equally managers as well as staff are, they're equally at risk of experiencing. And so there's three key areas of burnout to look out for. The first one is around emotional exhaustion. So this is about feeling absolutely drained, like you've got nothing left in the tank. You don't have the mental space to be empathetic, you don't have the space to be compassionate, and you just feel completely overwhelmed. And that can be experienced as feeling tired as soon as you wake up, not feeling rested, having a lack of motivation to do anything, particularly things that you'd usually enjoy, or you start to really dread work or tasks that you've got to do. So that's one aspect of it to look out for. The second one is around cynicism and feeling detached, or sort of having this emotional distancing. And that really happens as a way to cope with exhaustion. But it can lead to you feeling indifferent about things, feeling numb, feeling cynical or overly negative towards your work or people at work, or feeling disconnected from the things that normally give you joy. So yeah, cynicism and detachment is another one. And the final one is around what we call reduced personal accomplishment. So that's feeling that you're not very effective at your job anymore, that you're not good at your job. Even you might have thoughts around, what's the point in doing something, because nobody cares anyway. The organisation doesn't care, and you feel that your efforts are futile and not valued. And you might recognise in yourself or someone else that their productivity and their enthusiasm for work isn't there anymore. And what that actually feels like would be that you can't keep up with demands, that you don't feel creative anymore, you don't feel innovative, you're having self-doubt thoughts, there's thoughts around self-criticism, and a sense that you're just not making a meaningful impact anymore. So they're definitely, they're the classic signs that somebody's experiencing burnout.
And Jo, what have you found helpful? If personally, is there any sort of reflections from yourself that you embody, just to, I guess, in a way, mitigate some of that emotional toll? Like you said, over the long term, over sort of 20 or so years.
Yeah, gosh, it's just it is difficult to deal with it, and it's difficult, even as somebody who's got a real interest in this area, I still get burnt out as well. It creeps up on me and I don't recognize it. But ways of dealing with it is, for example, having boundaries around your work. And obviously that can be really difficult if you're on the front line. But if you're more office-based, for example, you're a manager, it's like having strict time to log off from your emails and not checking your emails until you're next at work. But regardless of whether you're office-based or out on the front line, it's a good tip would be to practice resting. To spend time in nature and actually be present in the moment, go outside, take a walk in the countryside or whatever, listen to the birds singing, and actually, being right in that moment and having that chill out time, and prioritizing you, even if it's just for a short time. I get how busy life is with family and trying to get everything done at home and all the rest of it. But it is so valuable just to take even a short amount of time for yourself, just to go and be and have that space, that mental space. And then if you're thinking about the cynicism side of it, one way we can help to manage that is by spending time with those who you like being around, whether that's family, friends, or wherever. Saying no to tasks at work where that's appropriate to do so. Prioritizing your workload. Some things just will have to wait. You can't do everything. And then another way around it is to reframe your thoughts. So, like I said about challenging those negative thoughts, which thoughts are realistic, and if they're not realistic, replacing them with thoughts that are. And then if we take the accomplishment side of things, even if you have one, you could feel completely overwhelmed, but just have in mind one daily goal that you want to achieve. So mine, really quite randomly, just as an example, the other day was to go to the tip and get rid of a load of stuff that's been cluttering up my house. And I've been wanting to do it for ages. And I finally said to myself, right, you're going to get that done. And I did. So it's about doing even random small things like that, and noticing those small wins. Other ways you could do it would be like asking people for feedback about something you did at work. And also, I think this one's really important. It's about keeping in check who we are, our identity. So reminding ourselves that first and foremost, we're humans. We're people. We're people with family and friends. And secondly, we're paramedics or ambulance personnel. And that our value as people isn't actually tied to our role or what we do at work. I think that's really important because sometimes in this field, we can sort of get caught up really in being a paramedic or ambulance person, and that lives out in our day-to-day lives, and it's important to remember that we're also people, away from being that role.
So, Jo, just as we come into land, a couple more questions. One would be really around, if there is a systemic issue that, or indeed a systemic kind of maybe mitigation strategy that could help reduce burnout and or psychological distress in the ambulance service and or staff. I know there's not one necessarily. There's never a magic bullet, but is there a pejorative theme that you see that could be, I guess, in a way enacted to reduce burnout?
Yeah, oh gosh, I wish I had a magic wand. There's so much that I'd love to do. But I think having thought about this question, and looked at my own experiences and the research that I've done and the research other people have done. I mean, really, for me, it comes down to organizations being trauma informed and genuinely recognizing the impact and influence that the organizations have and the culture has and leadership can have on employees, because it is so influential. And particularly, one thing for me is around communication and how that happens within organizations, how people talk to each other and how they listen to each other. It's this really simple stuff that is totally underrated, for the influence and effects that it can have, but it can be so powerful.
And just finally, Jo, could I get you to maybe walk us through some of the research and indeed what areas of research really need more of a deep dive and indeed more of a more exploring when it comes to informal coping mechanisms and psychological well-being in paramedicine?
Yeah, I love this question because I just love researching in this area. Um, so I think, to be honest, there's certainly more research out there now, compared to what there was when I first started researching in this area. But overall, there still isn't really a great deal when you compare it to other professions like police officers and nursing. So I think we're in a a space where there's actually room for a lot more research across all areas of psychological wellbeing and coping, and organisational culture and how that all feeds in. Yeah, and personally, my interests are around trauma and how that plays out within organisations, particularly from the social psychology perspective, about psychological safety, group attitudes and behaviours, excuse me, and how that sort of comes together as a culture and impacts psychological responses of those in that group. And one thing I'm particularly interested in is how that manifests under usual circumstances, like we've kind of talked about, but then how that changes and is exacerbated following disasters and major incidents. So like it's such a wide area. There's so much more research to do. Particularly if we're talking about the UK, there's far less research here in the UK than there is compared to, say, Australia, and some of the European countries. So yeah, it's really quite open-ended at the moment. There's lots of ways to go with it.
Yeah, indeed. I think what we'll do is we'll include your research within the show notes, Jo, and I think
Thank you.
that's a great baseline, and it helps people understand some of the empirical research, but that you've done, both qualitative and quantitative, and but also the areas, as you were saying, that still need to be explored. Listen, thank you for the last hour. It's just, you know, a real privilege just to get your received wisdom and thoughts on this topic. So thank you, Jo.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.